The cabin lights glowed softly, passengers settling into their seats with the quiet rustle of luggage and safety cards. For most on board, it was just another flight. But for one woman seated near the front, this journey was about to become an ordeal the world would never forget. The first signs of trouble weren't loud. A clipped tone, an impatient glance, a muttered remark that drew the attention of nearby travelers. The flight attendant, rigid in posture, moved with a sharpness that made people shift in their seats. She leaned down, her voice rising above the hush of the cabin. "Sit down," she snapped. Her hand shot forward, pressing against the shoulder of a black woman seated calmly in first class. The shove wasn't hard enough to injure, but strong enough to send a message. "You don't belong here." Gasps rippled down the aisle. A child clutched his mother's sleeve. A man craned his neck to record on his phone. What should have been an uneventful flight had changed in an instant, igniting a moment that passengers would replay in their minds long after their feet touched the ground. The woman pushed was not only a traveler. She was Lady Judith Clare, one of the most powerful legal figures in the United States. Her presence in that cabin carried history, authority, and dignity. Yet, even with decades of service to justice, she found herself stripped of humanity in the eyes of a stranger in uniform. The confrontation escalated. The attendant's voice sharpened, demanding compliance, as though the simple act of standing to stretch or walking toward the restroom was a challenge to order. Passengers shifted uncomfortably, caught between disbelief and fear. One woman whispered to her husband, "That's the justice. I'm sure of it." The man only nodded, keeping his phone steady as it recorded. In the stillness that followed, the black woman's response wasn't anger. It wasn't a raised voice, it was silent. A silence so composed that it unsettled those watching even more than the shove itself. She straightened her jacket, sat back down and fixed her gaze ahead, refusing to yield an ounce of dignity to the humiliation hurled her way. For a few seconds, no one breathed. Then the attendant's words rang out again, louder this time. "If you don't follow instructions, you'll be removed from this flight." Removed. The word lingered like smoke. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances. Could a woman of her stature, her identity, really be threatened with removal like a common criminal? The disbelief coursing through the cabin made it clear. What had just happened wasn't only about one seat, one woman, or one flight. It was about something much deeper. Something that had been simmering beneath the surface of daily life, now erupting where the whole world could see. Stories like this matter. If you want to see more true human stories that expose injustice and reveal the strength behind survival, make sure you subscribe right now. And in the comments, tell us, what country are you watching from? We want to hear your voice in this conversation. Back in the cabin, the silence was broken not by passengers, but by the steady resolve of Lady Judith herself. Slowly, she reached for her bag, slid her phone into her palm, and began to dial. The tension was unbearable. No one knew who she was calling. No one knew what words would be spoken. But there was an authority in her movements, a certainty that left the crew uneasy. A young man in row 4 lowered his voice to the woman beside him. "She's not playing around. Something's about to happen." The attendant, sensing her control slipping, barked out once more, but the cracks in her confidence were showing. The passengers could see it. They weren't just witnessing a disagreement, they were standing at the edge of something monumental. The phone reached her ear. A pause, a quiet greeting, her voice calm and steady, carried across the rows. And then, the captain's intercom crackled overhead, his words clipped and urgent. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been instructed to divert. We are grounding this aircraft immediately." Gasps, murmurs, confusion spreads like fire. What had she said on that call? What force could ground a plane mid-flight with a single conversation? Passengers leaned forward, whispering, eyes wide, hearts pounding. Every gaze fixed on the woman who had been shoved only minutes earlier, and at that moment, everyone understood. This was no ordinary passenger, no ordinary conflict. The truth of who she was, and the storm about to break, would shake not only the people on that flight, but the nation watching soon after. The plane was still in the air, but it already felt like the ground was shifting beneath them. What came next would define more than just a flight. It would define the boundaries of justice itself. Long before her name carried the weight of the Supreme Court, Lady Judith Clare was a little girl in Birmingham, Alabama, sitting on the porch of a modest brick home, flipping through tattered law books borrowed from the library. Her father, a postal worker, often came home with tired eyes and calloused hands, But he always reminded her, books are where battles are fought before courtrooms ever see them. Her mother, a schoolteacher, kept the shelves stacked with stories of Harriet Tubman, Thurgood Marshall, and Fannie Lou Hamer. Those names were not just history lessons. They were blueprints for survival. Judith's path was never cushioned. At 12, she was mocked by classmates for dreaming of becoming a lawyer. At 16, she was told she was too direct when she challenged a teacher's unfair grading. By 19, she was the only black woman in a lecture hall of 200 at Harvard Law. Professors doubted her, peers whispered that her presence was charity, but every insult and every doubt became fuel. She graduated at the top of her class, argued landmark cases as a civil rights attorney, and made history when she was nominated to the federal bench. It wasn't just her intellect that won cases. It was the way she spoke, measured, deliberate, with a voice that carried not just the law, but lived experience. When her name was eventually called to serve on the Supreme Court, it wasn't simply a career milestone. It was a generational triumph. Proof that resilience carved from years of prejudice could rise to the highest chamber of justice. But power does not insulate from bias. Judith knew this well. Even in her robes, she endured thinly veiled condescension, colleagues questioning her opinions more than others, reporters dissecting her tone rather than her legal reasoning. Resilient was the word most often used to describe her, but beneath that resilience was exhaustion, the kind only those who have had to justify their existence every day understand. On the morning of the flight, she wasn't traveling for luxury or leisure. She was en route to Miami to deliver a keynote at a historic legal conference. The theme? Justice without fear. For weeks, her staff had prepared, knowing her speech would highlight racial inequality in courts, housing, and policing. Hundreds of lawyers, judges, and students awaited her words. The irony would not be lost when she herself became the subject of injustice before even reaching the podium. She carried a leather briefcase, worn, scratched, but dignified. Inside were her notes, pages filled with handwritten edits in blue ink. She believed that words mattered most when they were lived, and every line reflected both her legal mind and her personal scars. Yet none of that mattered when she stepped into the airplane cabin. In that space, with strangers who didn't recognize or care who she was, her identity collapsed into a single reality: a black woman occupying a seat someone thought she didn't deserve. What made Lady Judith remarkable wasn't only her achievements but her restraint. She didn't fight battles with volume, she fought them with presence, with an unshakable calm that forced people to reckon with their own cruelty. But as the attendants' push and shouted words echoed down the aisle, that calm presence was tested in front of dozens of witnesses. She carried the law in her hands, yes. She carried the hopes of generations who had prayed for representation in the highest court. But none of that shielded her from the raw sting of prejudice in a confined cabin, 30,000 feet above the ground. On that plane, Lady Judith Clare was not Justice Clare. She was a black woman confronted by bias, and everyone was about to see what dignity looks like when it's forced to stand against humiliation. The airport gates bustled with the usual mixture of impatience and relief. Travelers clutched boarding passes, parents soothed restless children, business people scrolled through phones with eyes that never lifted. When Lady Judith Clare stepped forward at the priority line, she blended into the crowd in one sense, just another traveler waiting to take her seat. And yet her presence carried the gravity of someone who had weathered storms far beyond a boarding gate. She offered a small smile to the attendant scanning tickets. Her tone was polite, steady, unhurried, the kind of composure that came naturally to her after decades of courtrooms where one slip of emotion could cost an entire case. As the machine beeped and cleared her through, no one in that moment knew the weight of her name, or how the flight they were about to share would end up on headlines before the week was over. Judith walked the jet bridge with her leather briefcase in hand. The faint vibration of footsteps behind her reminded her she wasn't alone. Passengers of all kinds lined up, families bound for vacations, young couples snapping selfies, weary professionals chasing time zones. To them, it was simply a trip from New York to Miami. To Judith, it was the quiet before the storm of responsibility, a chance to gather her thoughts for the speech she would soon deliver. As she stepped into the first-class cabin, she nodded politely at the crew. Her voice was calm. "Good afternoon." The words hung in the air, unreturned. The flight attendant standing by the aisle, Janet Morrison, a white woman in her mid-30s, with tightly wound hair and a face that wore tension like a permanent expression, offered no smile, no warmth. Only a curt gesture toward the seat. Judith settled into her place, stowing her briefcase beneath the seat ahead with care. She straightened her jacket, adjusted the reading lamp, and opened a folder of notes. To her, it was a ritual of calm. To Janet, it seemed an intrusion. Her eyes flickered back toward Judith again and again, sharp, unsettled, as though questioning what authority allowed her to sit there at all. The unease did not go unnoticed. A man across the aisle raised his brows slightly, then went back to scrolling his phone. A young woman in row 2 shifted in her seat, her gaze darting between the two women as if sensing an imbalance that could snap at any moment. Subtle as it was, the air had changed. And it had changed because of one thing Judith couldn't hide: the color of her skin. Janet finally broke the silence, her tone edged. "Are you sure this is your seat?" The words were not shouted. They weren't delivered with outright hostility, but they carried the weight of doubt, of dismissal, of a question that never would have been asked had another passenger placed themselves in that same seat with pale skin and a tailored suit. Judith lifted her boarding pass calmly. "Yes, 2A." Her voice was steady, devoid of confrontation. Janet glanced at it briefly, then muttered, "Fine," before moving down the aisle to fuss with another passenger's luggage. But her stiffness lingered, her discontent clear to anyone paying attention. Passengers began whispering softly, the way strangers do when tension sparks in a confined space. Some dismissed it, chalking it up to a bad day for the crew. Others felt the unease crawl beneath their skin. They could sense that this was not a misunderstanding about a seat. It was something deeper, unspoken but loud. Judith returned to her notes, refusing to grant the slight any more power than it deserved. Yet even as she underlined a line from her speech, "Justice must not bow to intimidation," she knew her composure would soon be tested. Because bias, once stirred, rarely stays quiet. What began as a curt question about a seat was only the opening act. The confrontation had already been written in the sharp edges of Janet's posture, in the way her eyes narrowed each time she looked Judith's way. Passengers might not have realized it yet, but the stage was set. And before the cabin door even closed, the fight for dignity had already begun. The cabin door shut with a thud, and the familiar safety demonstration began. Passengers half listened, half scrolled through screens, while the engines started their low rumble beneath the floor. For most, it was the ordinary rhythm of air travel. For Lady Judith Clare, however, the unease of her first interaction lingered like a stain on an otherwise calm mind. After takeoff, as the plane leveled into the sky, the first-class cabin began its usual service. Janet Morrison reappeared, tray in hand, her expression locked in a tight mask of efficiency. She moved from row to row, leaning down with a clipped, "What would you like to drink?" Passengers responded easily. Wine, soda, sparkling water, and glasses were handed over without delay. When she reached Judith's row, her pace slowed. She looked down at the justice with an almost imperceptible hesitation, as though the request she was about to hear was already a burden. "Still water, please," Judith said softly, closing the folder of notes on her lap. No acknowledgement. Janet turned her head slightly, then pivoted toward the next passenger, across the aisle. "And for you?" she asked, voice suddenly bright. The man requested a glass of red wine. Within moments, a stemmed glass was placed in front of him. Another passenger received sparkling water, followed by a napkin folded neatly at the corner of their tray. Judith's request remained ignored. She waited, her patience steady, as Janet moved down the aisle, delivering drinks as though nothing had been asked of her moments earlier. The passengers nearby noticed. A woman in row 3 frowned slightly, whispering to her husband. The man with the phone from earlier raised it discreetly again, sensing the need to document. When Janet returned, Judith's voice remained calm. "Excuse me, I asked for water earlier." The attendant's posture stiffened. She bent down just enough for her words to cut through the air. "You didn't give me a chance. You're being demanding." The passengers nearby stirred. A few exchanged glances, uncomfortable with the tone. Judith, ever composed, folded her hands on the armrest and spoke evenly. "I only requested once. That's not being demanding." The reply came quick, sharp, and loud enough for half the cabin to hear. "You people always think rules don't apply to you." A hush spread instantly. It was the kind of silence that doesn't come from peace, but from shock. Words that should never have been said now floated heavy in the air, impossible to take back. Judith's face remained still, but the sting of the remark was undeniable. The choice of phrase, "you people," landed with centuries of weight behind it. Every passenger in earshot knew what it meant. A man in the back cleared his throat as if to break the silence. A young woman gasped audibly. The phone in the aisle seat recorded steadily, capturing every detail. Judith did not match hostility with hostility. Instead, she straightened in her seat, her voice steady. "I expect to be treated like any other passenger, nothing more." Her words were measured, deliberate, but the restraint only seemed to fuel Janet's irritation. She snatched a bottle of water from the tray, set it down with a sharp thud that splashed droplets onto Judith's notes, and walked away without another glance. The passengers' eyes followed her, then returned to Judith. Some looked away quickly, afraid of being drawn into the conflict. Others stared openly, their expressions a mixture of sympathy and disbelief. The flight continued, but the comfort of routine had been broken. Conversations died mid-sentence, the soft chatter replaced by an uneasy quiet. Everyone knew they had just witnessed something more than poor service. They had seen the thin veil of professionalism slip, revealing bias, raw and unfiltered. And for Judith, the tension was no longer subtle. It was a line drawn boldly in the open, daring her to respond. She wouldn't need to raise her voice. Her response would come later, and it would shake the entire plane. The plane had settled into its steady rhythm, engines humming beneath the cabin floor, but the earlier exchange hadn't been forgotten. Passengers sat straighter, glancing toward the first row of seats with the unease of people who knew more was coming. Lady Judith Clare remained composed, pen in hand, jotting small notes in the margins of her speech. Each stroke was deliberate, as if her focus on ink and paper could shield her from the growing hostility a few feet away. Yet she could feel eyes on her, not only from the passengers who sympathized, but from the attendant whose simmering resentment had not cooled. Janet Morrison reappeared with her cart, her steps sharp against the carpet. She distributed snacks without a word, placing them neatly before every passenger, except Judith. The omission was deliberate. A man across the aisle leaned forward, his brow furrowed, but said nothing. Judith raised her gaze briefly, calm but unyielding, then returned to her notes. The tension snapped minutes later when Judith rose from her seat. Quietly, with the dignity of someone accustomed to scrutiny, she stepped into the aisle, intending to make her way toward the restroom. She had barely taken 2 steps when Janet's voice sliced through the quiet. "Sit back down," the attendant ordered, tone laced with authority she did not have. Judith turned her head slightly. "I need to use the restroom." Her words were even, respectful, nothing out of the ordinary. But Janet's eyes narrowed. She stepped into the aisle, blocking the path, her frame rigid with hostility. "You're not allowed to move when we're preparing service. Sit down." The passengers shifted, some clutching armrests, others raising phones again to record. They had seen passengers walk to restrooms countless times during service. This was not about safety. This was about control. Judith met Janet's glare without flinching. "I will not cause a disruption. I only intend to use the restroom." Janet's lips thinned. Her hand shot out, pressing against Judith's shoulder with enough force to push her backward. The shove was sudden, jarring, the kind of gesture meant not only to stop movement, but to humiliate. A collective gasp filled the cabin. The sound of disbelief spread row by row as the sight sank in. A uniformed flight attendant physically shoving a Supreme Court justice back into her seat. Judith stumbled slightly but regained her balance, easing herself back into her chair with the same quiet dignity she had carried since boarding. She didn't shout. She didn't retaliate. She simply adjusted her jacket, folded her hands, and faced forward. But the damage was already done. The shove was more than an act of aggression. It was the embodiment of a deeper message. That no matter the titles earned, no matter the history carried, prejudice would still dare to strip dignity from a black woman at 30,000 feet. A woman a few rows behind whispered urgently to her husband, "That's Justice Clare. I'm sure it's her." The man's eyes widened as recognition dawned. He leaned forward, whispering louder than he intended, "She's on the Supreme Court." Murmurs rippled across the cabin. Some passengers were horrified, others incredulous. The weight of what they had just witnessed was beginning to sink in. This wasn't only an act of rudeness. It was an assault on a woman whose very life's work was upholding justice. Janet, realizing the stares converging on her, crossed her arms defensively. She was aggressive, she announced, trying to justify her actions to the watching cabin. She doesn't follow instructions. But the passengers knew what they had seen. The phone's recording told a different story. Judith had remained calm, deliberate, composed, while Janet's hostility had crossed a line. The silence in the cabin was thick now, broken only by the occasional click of cameras and the nervous cough of a man in the back. Everyone waited, eyes locked on the woman in seat 2A. Judith did not respond immediately. Her pause was deliberate, a silence that forced the weight of the shove to linger in the air. Then, in a voice steady as stone, she said, "Respect is not optional, it's a right." Her words hung in the air, carrying further than any outburst could have. And though the engines still carried the plane smoothly through the sky, those on board knew turbulence had already begun, the kind no seatbelt could restrain. For a long, breathless moment, the cabin froze. Every passenger had seen it. The shove the authorities stripped away in a single degrading gesture. The hum of the engines was steady, but inside the cabin, silence roared. A woman in row 3 lowered her phone, eyes wide. "Did she really just push her?" she whispered, though her question needed no answer. The camera in her hand had already captured it. Across the aisle, a middle-aged businessman straightened in his seat. He adjusted his tie, his voice firm. "She wasn't aggressive," he muttered aloud, his words directed at no one in particular. "I saw the whole thing." But he didn't rise. His declaration hung weakly in the air, more a statement of conscience than action. 2 rows behind, the young mother clutched the hand of her son. She leaned down, her voice trembling. "That's Justice Clare. She's the one on the court." Her words carried, spreading recognition through the rows like a spark catching dry grass. Eyes widened, glances darted, whispers turned to murmurs. Some passengers looked directly at Janet Morrison, their expressions hardening with disapproval. Others turned away, afraid of confrontation, shrinking into their seats. It was as if the cabin itself had divided into 2 courts, one silent with complicity, the other buzzing with outrage. Janet, sensing her authority slipping, raised her chin defiantly. She refused to follow instructions, she insisted, loud enough for the front cabin to hear. She was confrontational. Her words, meant to regain control, only fueled the discomfort. Passengers had witnessed the opposite. Judith's calm demeanor, her restraint in the face of open hostility, was undeniable. Phones were lifted higher now, lenses capturing every gesture. A young man angled his camera deliberately, narrating quietly under his breath. "First-class passenger, shoved by the attendant. She's not doing anything wrong." His voice trembled with the awareness that what he was filming was more than a viral clip. It was evidence. Judith herself remained composed, sitting tall in her seat, eyes forward. Her silence was louder than any protest. That composure unsettled Janet more than words ever could. The tension broke when a soft but steady voice rose from the back of first class. An older woman, silver-haired and dignified, leaned into the aisle. "This is unacceptable," she said firmly. "I don't care who she is or isn't. No passenger deserves that." Her words drew a smattering of nods. A man clapped softly once, then stopped, unsure if the moment demanded applause or solemnity. But the point was made. People were watching, and they were no longer entirely silent. Still, not everyone sided with Judith. A man in a business suit cleared his throat. "Let the crew do their job," he said dismissively. "We don't need trouble in the air." His comment earned him glares from nearby passengers, but it revealed the divide between those willing to call out injustice and those too comfortable to challenge authority. Janet seized on his words, her confidence momentarily buoyed. "Exactly," she said quickly. "She's disrupting the flight." But the faces around her told a different story. The young woman near the window muttered under her breath, "The only disruption is coming from you." Another whispered, "If she weren't black, none of this would be happening." The murmur of agreement spread. Even those who hadn't spoken exchanged glances heavy with recognition. Everyone knew what they had just witnessed wasn't about safety or rules. It was about race, plain and undeniable. And then the weight of recognition struck fully. Passengers realized who sat in seat 2A. The whispers of Justice Clare grew louder until the name itself carried through the cabin like a verdict. Phones kept recording, eyes locked on her. And though Lady Judith Clare had not spoken since being shoved, her silence, her dignity, and her presence had already turned the cabin into a courtroom. The jury, however, wasn't 12 strangers in a box. It was dozens of passengers, and soon the entire nation watching through their screens. And the verdict on what had just happened was already clear. The murmurs in the cabin had swelled into an uneasy chorus. Passengers were whispering, debating, recording, some even daring to speak out. But through it all, Lady Judith Clare sat still, her posture unshaken, her silence deliberate. It was the silence of someone who understood power, Not the loud, flailing kind that demands attention, but the kind that waits, measured, and then moves with undeniable force. She reached slowly for her briefcase. The leather creaked softly as she drew it onto her lap, unclasping it with a composure that contrasted sharply with the frantic energy in the cabin. From inside, she pulled out her phone. Her hands didn't tremble. Her face didn't harden with rage. Instead, she tapped the screen with the same calm decisiveness she had shown on the bench, where every word carried the weight of law. Passengers leaned forward. Some recognized the ritual, the moment before a shift, before something irreversible took place. A young man with his camera whispered into the lens, "She's calling someone. This is about to change everything." Janet Morrison, sensing her grip on authority slipping, stepped forward again. "Ma'am, you cannot use your phone during service. I'm telling you now." Judith raised her hand, not in defiance, but in quiet assertion. Her eyes locked on Janet's, and for the first time, the attendant faltered. There was something in that gaze, centuries of injustice endured, and the unflinching strength of someone who would no longer be diminished. She lifted the phone to her ear. The cabin quieted, the way a courtroom stills when a verdict is about to be read. Her voice, low but clear, carried through the space. "This is Justice Clare. Connect me to the Federal Aviation Liaison." The words cut through the cabin like a blade. Some passengers gasped outright. Others froze, their suspicions confirmed. They weren't just witnessing discrimination against a woman of dignity. They were witnessing an affront to one of the highest judicial authorities in the United States. Janet's face drained of color. For the first time, she took a step back. You can't just..." Judith ignored her, her attention fixed solely on the call. The pause stretched, passengers holding their breath. Then came her voice again, measured and unwavering. "Yes, I am currently in flight. I've been physically shoved by crew and publicly demeaned. I expect immediate intervention." Every word was documented, not just by the officials on the other end, but by every recording phone in the cabin. Within minutes, a man dressed in plain clothes rose quietly from the back of first class. His badge appeared discreetly at his chest, revealed only enough for those near him to see. An air marshal. He walked forward, leaned toward Judith, and spoke in low tones. She nodded once, calm as ever. The ripple of recognition spread further. Passengers looked between each other, their eyes wide. A hush fell, not of disbelief this time, but of inevitability. Something irreversible was unfolding. The marshal moved toward the cockpit, murmuring a few words to the captain. The intercom crackled seconds later, his voice deliberate, almost strained. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances requiring immediate attention, we have been instructed to divert. This aircraft will be grounded at the nearest airport." Gasps swept the cabin. Some passengers clasped their mouths. Others looked at Judith with awe. Phones captured it all. The moment an entire flight shifted course with a single phone call. Janet tried to protest, her voice shrill now. "She's exaggerating. She was disruptive." But her words carried no weight anymore. The passengers had seen the shove. They had heard the slur. They had recorded the neglect. And now, they had watched a Supreme Court justice call federal authorities mid-flight. Judith placed her phone back into her briefcase with calm finality, as though closing an argument she knew she had already won. She didn't look at Janet again. She didn't need to. The balance of power in the cabin had shifted permanently. And though the engines still carried them through the clouds, everyone on board knew the real landing had already begun, the landing of prejudice into accountability. The announcement from the cockpit left the cabin suspended in shock. "We have been instructed to divert. This aircraft will be grounded at the nearest airport." The captain's voice was steady, but the weight beneath his words was unmistakable. For a moment, passengers sat frozen, as though trying to process what they had just heard. Flights did not simply divert without reason, and now, everyone knew the reason was sitting in seat 2A. The young man with the phone whispered, "She just got this whole plane grounded." His words carried awe, not disbelief. Around him, others nodded silently. The atmosphere shifted from uneasy to electric. Every eye darted between Judith Clare, calm, unshaken, and Janet Morrison, who now stood stiff at the front of the cabin, her posture betraying panic she couldn't mask. The authority she had clung to moments earlier had evaporated, replaced with the undeniable reality that she was no longer in control. Passengers began whispering more openly now. A woman leaned across the aisle. "She's on the Supreme Court. That's who she is." Her voice was reverent, as if she'd only just realized the magnitude of the injustice they had witnessed. Another voice followed. "She represents the law itself, and look at how she's being treated." The murmurs spread until the cabin itself seemed to pulse with indignation. What had begun as quiet recording and hushed observation was turning into a collective reckoning. Judith sat still, her hands folded over her notes, her expression unreadable. To her, this was not a victory. It was a burden. A reminder that her status, her robes, her years of service to justice meant nothing in the face of prejudice. Yet her resolve remained intact. The plane began its descent. The pitch of the engines shifted, the ground drawing closer. Seatbelt signs blinked overhead, though no one needed reminding. They were all buckled into an unfolding moment of history. Janet moved down the aisle once more, attempting to reclaim professionalism. Her voice cracked as she insisted, "Please remain seated. This diversion is just precautionary." But the eyes that met hers were cold. No one believed her. Passengers had witnessed the truth. They had seen her shove, heard her words, felt the venom behind her tone. A passenger in row 5 spoke up, his voice cutting through the cabin. "Don't lie. We all saw what you did. You shoved her. You humiliated her." Janet's cheeks flushed, but she snapped back defensively. She was out of line. I was following procedure. Her protest only drew scoffs. Another voice called out, "Procedure doesn't include racism." A murmur of agreement followed, passengers emboldened now that the balance had shifted. The descent quickened. Out the windows, the stretch of tarmac came into view. Passengers pressed against the glass, their anticipation palpable. This was no ordinary landing. It was a public reckoning in motion. The wheels screeched against the runway. The cabin jolted forward as the plane braked hard, slowing quickly as it veered toward a remote section of the airport. Through the small oval windows, flashing lights appeared, airport security vehicles lining the taxiway. Gasps rose as the reality sank in. This wasn't just a diversion. This was an intervention. The engines wound down, the cabin falling into a heavy silence. Everyone knew what came next. The authorities would board. They would not be speaking to Lady Judith Clare as a suspect. They would be coming for the woman who had mistaken prejudice for authority. Janet clutched her clipboard like a shield, her lips pressed thin. Her earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced with the tight mask of someone realizing her career might be over. And at the center of it all sat Lady Judith, unmoving, her calm presence a stark contrast to the chaos swirling around her. She didn't need to say a word. Justice was already descending with them, step by step, until the doors opened and accountability walked in. The plane rolled to a stop at the far end of the runway, isolated from the main terminal. Through the oval windows, passengers saw flashing lights converge, airport security vehicles, their beams slicing across the dusk. A heavy silence pressed over the cabin, every passenger aware they were at the center of something far larger than a travel inconvenience. The seatbelt sign dinged off, but no one moved. The tension was too thick, the anticipation too sharp. Heads turned toward the front, where Janet Morrison stood rigid, her hands clasped so tightly around her clipboard that her knuckles had gone pale. The door hissed open. The metal groan of the jet bridge did not follow. Instead, the narrow steps clanged as a team of uniformed officers boarded, their presence firm and undeniable. Behind them, a man in a tailored suit with an airport operations badge followed, his expression grave. "Where is Justice Clare?" one of the officers asked, his voice calm but carrying the weight of certainty. Dozens of eyes turned to seat 2A. Judith raised her gaze, her composure unbroken. She inclined her head slightly, answering without words. The officers nodded with respect, their demeanor shifting instantly, not as though they were addressing a passenger, but as though they were standing in the presence of authority itself. And then the focus turned. The operations manager stepped forward, his tone clipped. Which crew member had the altercation? Before anyone could answer, several passengers pointed at once. "Her," one said firmly. "She shoved her." Another added, "I have it on video." The voices overlapped, the truth impossible to deny. Janet's lips parted, her voice faltering. "This is all a misunderstanding." She was difficult. Enough. The officer cut her off, his tone flat. "We've received the report. You'll come with us." Gasps rippled through the cabin. Phones tilted higher, capturing every second. Passengers who had sat frozen in silence earlier now sat straighter, emboldened by the sight of accountability unfolding in real time. Janet sputtered. "This is outrageous. She's exaggerating. I was just doing my job." The older woman with silver hair from earlier spoke up again, her voice steady and strong. "No, you were abusing your power. We all saw it." Others murmured their agreement. The officer took Janet by the arm, not harshly, but with the unmistakable authority of someone escorting a person out of power. The clipboard fell from her grip, clattering against the aisle floor. Passengers watched as she was guided toward the door, her protests fading into the heavy silence. Judith remained still. She hadn't risen, hadn't spoken since her phone call. Her silence was no longer simply composure. It was a statement. She didn't need to demand respect. Respect arrived on its own, carried in the way the officers deferred to her, the way the passengers looked to her as though she embodied justice itself. A man across the aisle finally spoke, his voice almost reverent. "It shouldn't take someone like you for them to listen, but I'm glad you were here." His words trembled with truth, a truth every black passenger in that cabin understood. Had it been someone without her title, the outcome might have been very different. Outside, the flashing lights continued to sweep the windows, a reminder that this incident had already outgrown the plane. Inside, the cabin was transformed into something resembling a courtroom, where witnesses had testified, evidence had been gathered, and judgment had begun. As the officers prepared to escort Janet fully off the aircraft, the operations manager turned back to Judith. "Justice Claire, we deeply regret what has happened. You'll be debriefed once we return to the terminal." She gave a simple nod. No grand speech, no condemnation, just dignity, steady and immovable. But the passengers saw more than her silence. They saw the message written plainly across her composure. Injustice would not stand unchallenged, even in the most confined of spaces. The door closed behind Janet Morrison, and with it, the cabin exhaled. Not relief, but the recognition that they had just witnessed the beginning of something far larger than a flight delay. By the time the plane reached the gate, the story had already outrun the wheels. Passengers disembarked with phones buzzing, notifications lighting up screens as clips of the shove, the slur, and the grounding spread like wildfire. What had started as whispers in a cabin was now a chorus across social media platforms. The first video, shaky but clear, showed Janet Morrison blocking Judith's path, followed by the shove. Another clip captured her sharp words, "You people always think rules don't apply to you." Within minutes, hashtags surged. Justice in the skies, flying while black, respect Justice Claire. Across the country, phones lit up. In living rooms, offices, coffee shops, and airports, people watched the same sequence of seconds, pausing and replaying in disbelief. Comment sections flooded with outrage. "If this can happen to a Supreme Court justice, what chance does an ordinary black traveler have?" wrote one user. Another posted, "No uniform, no title, no power should give someone the right to treat another human being like this." Newsrooms scrambled. Anchors interrupted scheduled segments with breaking banners. Supreme Court Justice Judith Claire was allegedly shoved and verbally attacked by a flight attendant during a routine flight to Miami. The aircraft was diverted and grounded. Civil rights leaders appeared within hours on talk shows, their voices sharp with anger but steady with resolve. One attorney stated, "This isn't just an incident of rudeness. This is racism laid bare at 30,000 feet. Exposed only because it happened to someone the world recognizes." Think about how many similar incidents vanish because the victim doesn't have a title or cameras to protect them. The airline's response came swiftly but cold. A statement released to the press read, "We regret the disruption experienced on Flight 762. The safety and comfort of all customers is our priority. At this time, we are cooperating fully with authorities to review the incident." The words landed like stone. Comfort? Safety? Passengers who had witnessed the shove filled the comment sections beneath the statement, dismantling its vagueness. "She wasn't disruptive. I was there. I saw it. Don't whitewash what we all recorded." The backlash grew louder. Analysts on business networks shook their heads at the airline's misstep. They are underestimating the damage. This isn't about one employee. This is about systemic bias. In communities across the country, especially among black travelers, the story resonated with painful familiarity. Social media threads filled with testimonies. People denied boarding, questioned about their seats, spoken to with tones that reduced them to suspicion instead of respect. Lady Judith Claire had become the symbol of those countless untold stories. And yet through the growing storm, Judith herself remained composed. She hadn't released a statement, hadn't spoken a word to the press. But her silence wasn't absence. It was power. Everyone waited, knowing that when she chose to speak, it would not be noise. It would be judgment. Late that evening, as the videos reached millions of views, a commentator summarized what many felt. "This is bigger than an airline. This is about how racism strips dignity, even from the most accomplished among us. If Lady Judith Claire isn't safe from it, who is?" Injustice had been dragged into the light, mid-flight, and no press release could hide it. The outrage was national now, and the question was no longer whether accountability would come, but how far it would reach. For nearly 24 hours, the nation had been speaking for her. Commentators debated, hashtags trended, passengers gave interviews. But Lady Judith Clare had not said a single word beyond the calm statement she made in the cabin. Some mistook her silence for hesitation. Others recognized it for what it was, patience. She was waiting for the right moment to speak, when her words could no longer be dismissed as reactionary, but instead would echo as judgment. That moment arrived the next evening. A lectern had been placed at the center of a crowded press hall in Miami. The legal conference she had been traveling to was still underway, and organizers had shifted the spotlight from her keynote to an urgent press address. Cameras clicked, microphones extended, and a quiet anticipation filled the room as she approached the podium. She did not arrive with theatrics. No entourage flanked her. She carried only her notes, the same folder she had held on the plane, its corners now slightly wrinkled. Her voice, when it rose, was calm, steady, and deliberate. "I was traveling as any citizen does," she began. "I presented my boarding pass, took my assigned seat, and expected only to be treated with the same dignity afforded to others. Instead, I was questioned, shoved, and demeaned, and I was not addressed as a passenger, but as a black woman presumed not to belong." The room hushed, the only sounds the clicks of cameras and the rapid scratching of reporters' pens. "If this can happen to me," she continued, "someone with visibility, authority, and influence, then what happens to those who cannot call federal offices mid-flight? What happens to the mother traveling alone with her children, to the student on their first trip abroad, to the countless black travelers whose dignity is stripped in ways that never reach the headlines?" Her words shifted the focus away from herself. She was not simply recounting an incident. She was holding up a mirror to a nation that wanted to treat her experience as an anomaly, when it was, in truth, part of a much deeper pattern. "The danger is not only in the shove or the slur," she said, her voice firming. "The danger is in the silence that often follows, in the passengers who look away, in the systems that issue statements rather than change, in the indifference that lets prejudice disguise itself as procedure." Applause broke out, not the kind that interrupts, but the kind that bursts forth when words strike a nerve too raw to suppress. She raised her hand gently, silencing the room again. "I do not seek punishment for one individual. My concern is not a single name on a uniform. My concern is a system that allowed her to believe she could act that way without consequence." Her eyes scanned the room, meeting the gaze of the reporters, the cameras, the public beyond the walls. Accountability is not optional. Not for airlines, not for any institution that serves the public. We cannot claim safety in the skies while prejudice sits in the aisle. We cannot claim equal rights if dignity is conditional. The speech was brief, less than 15 minutes, but it carried more weight than hours of debate. She concluded not with outrage, but with resolve. "I will continue to serve on the bench with fairness, but fairness must extend beyond courtrooms. It must live in our daily lives. Justice is not just a robe. It is how we treat one another when no one is watching." As she stepped away from the podium, the applause thundered, rolling across the hall and spilling onto the feeds of millions watching live. Hashtags reignited with new force. News anchors replayed her words. Commentators acknowledged the shift. The story was no longer about one flight. It was about a national reckoning with how racism moves unchecked in ordinary spaces. Her response had not been angry, but it had been unyielding. And it made clear that this fight was never about her alone. Lady Judith Clare's words did not vanish when the applause ended. They spread, replayed in clips across television broadcasts, quoted in op-eds, dissected in classrooms, and shared millions of times online. The speech was not treated as one woman's testimony, but as a national summons. Within a week, the Senate Judiciary Committee announced hearings on racial discrimination in air travel. Senators from both parties admitted the incident had peeled back layers of complacency. If a Supreme Court justice can be shoved on a plane because of the color of her skin, one lawmaker said, then every black traveler is at risk. Airline executives were called to testify. The footage played on massive screens in the chamber. Janet Morrison's shove, her cutting words, Judith's calm response, the subsequent grounding. The executives shifted uncomfortably under the weight of questions. Why had training failed? Why did passengers report patterns of discrimination? from seat questioning to disproportionate removals of black travelers. Why were so many complaints dismissed as misunderstandings? Civil rights groups submitted data that confirmed what many already knew. Black passengers were more likely to be stopped at boarding gates, more likely to be questioned about their seats, and more likely to be labeled disruptive when raising concerns. The incident on Flight 7662 was not an isolated eruption. It was the most visible example of a problem festering for years. The airline involved scrambled to contain the fallout. They announced immediate reforms, mandatory anti-bias training for all crew, stricter oversight of in-flight complaints, and the creation of a passenger civil rights board. But critics were quick to remind the public that training alone would not erase prejudice. Policy without accountability is just paperwork, one advocate testified. Meanwhile, other airlines, fearful of becoming the next headline, rushed to release their own reform plans. Airport staff were retrained, cabin crews were briefed on new codes of conduct. Suddenly, the entire industry was forced to examine itself, not out of goodwill, but out of necessity. For Judith, the fight did not end at the podium. She worked quietly with civil rights lawyers to draft proposals for federal regulation. Within months, the Department of Transportation introduced new rules. Passengers could no longer be removed from flights without a written justification reviewed by independent oversight, and repeat offenders among crew would be subject to dismissal. But the impact went beyond policies. The cultural conversation had shifted. Passengers began speaking up more readily when they saw unfair treatment in the skies. Videos of interventions circulated. Strangers defending strangers, invoking Justice Claire as shorthand for courage. Her name became not only a marker of judicial authority, but of resistance to silent prejudice. Janet Morrison, the attendant at the center of the incident, was fired and barred from future employment in the airline industry. Yet even as her name faded, the larger truth remained. She was not an outlier. She was the symptom of a deeper illness that could no longer be ignored. For Lady Judith, the reforms were important, but they came at a personal cost. Each time she stood before cameras or hearings, she carried not only her own dignity, but the unspoken stories of countless others who had suffered without witnesses. Her resolve was steady, but she often reminded listeners, change must not depend on who is watching. It must be lived, every day, whether cameras are present or not. The grounding of one plane had become the grounding of an entire industry's complacency. And though work remained, a truth had been etched into the public conscience. Dignity in the skies was not optional. Justice had to travel with everyone.